Just to give some background, I'm trying to make this talk as a transition from what we have been speaking about before, about the interpretation of probability and that we have to make judgments considering evidence, into Bayesian modeling, where we specify models for data and we make we run advanced methods for updating, and then we will talk about teaching later on and applications. So my name is Ullrika Sahlin, and I am an associate professor at the university. I spend most of my time, and I think Dimitri is very disappointed about this, but I'm working with a European agency supporting their work in characterizing uncertainty when they perform scientific assessments. So in that sense, it's very much related to the talk we just heard about legal decision making, but we are working with doing scientific assessments of risks within the food safety area. And I will talk a little bit about how we work with expert judgment in this context and the use of Bayesian modeling. So trying to change slide here, it doesn't work. Okay, so judgments are needed in scientific advice and in research. We can say that all decisions we make are based on judgments about the world. And when we're producing scientific advice, it requires judgments. It requires judgments in how we should specify the model, how we should evaluate the available evidence, and how we should take into account everything that might influence the conclusion we have. And when we do research, the difference between research and making scientific assessment would be that when we do research, we can sort of choose the problem we would like to work with, and we can plan data collection so it's sort of perfect for the question at hand. We maybe have less urgency or limitations to do the assessment. And we don't have this very clear demand to communicate uncertainty in the conclusion in a way that is honest and useful for decision making. But that is the setting where I'm working with on how to characterize uncertainty. So when I think about conclusions in safety assessment, and this is like, it's not exactly how EFSA is framing them. I made them a bit simplified here, but one can think about there are different ways of presenting a conclusion. We can just say that this is safe. This is a safe dose of a chemical substance, given the evidence that we have available. We can also say that this is safe, but there is a lot of uncertainties here in this estimate. We can also say, taking into account all available evidence and everything that we can think of that might influence our certainty about the conclusion, we are certain, or this certain, that this is a safe dose. So you can see here there are different levels that we can communicate uncertainty in the conclusion. So just to sort of introduce some terminology, so let A be the outcome or the event that we're interested in. So in this case, whether the doses equal or below this dose are safe. So, and then of course it assumes that we have a definition of safe, which one can discuss. And then the assessment problem that the scientific experts are working with is to find the dose that the experts are certain of that this outcome would apply, given everything that we have and the sources of uncertainty. So sources of uncertainty, well, there are tons of different taxonomies and frameworks suggesting how to work with sources of uncertainty. Here is one from Van den Bles that distinguish between variability, computational or systematic inadequacy in the measurements we have, limited knowledge or ignorance about the processes, and expert disagreement. And at the European Food Safety Authority, one is having a huge list of sources of uncertainty, but they can basically be divided into sources affecting the inputs coming into the assessment and sources of uncertainty related to the methodology that we have in the assessment. So when we are thinking about, okay, it's not enough to just say that there are sources of uncertainty. We should communicate uncertainty in the conclusion, because this is what is closest to decision making. So the task is to express the experts, which might be ourselves working as experts, certainty about the conclusion, given what we know and what we don't know, or know that we don't know. And this so-called overall uncertainty, it's a concept which we can call overall uncertainty. It's uncertainty about the conclusion. And that, together with how we reach that conclusion, like the path from evidence to conclusion, that is what matters for decision maker. That's what they need to make a decision. So in theory, just to sort of go back to the Bayesian methodology here, is that expressing uncertainty about conclusion is not very different from expressing uncertainty about the parameter and so on. But the difference is that the conclusion is at the very end of a long assessment process, and it's something that matters for decision making. Okay, so different organizations seem to have different approaches in characterizing uncertainty conclusions. So if we compare Cochrane and the IPCC, which are organizations producing scientific advice, they evaluate and they report the strength of the evidence qualitatively, and then they express uncertainty quantitatively. Like in Cochrane, they provide them side by side, two summaries of uncertainty related to the knowledge, where the quantitative estimates come in whenever we have statistical estimates coming out from models. But then they can also say that the strength of evidence was medium or low or so on. The International Panel of Climate Change, they report the strength of evidence, and they only report quantitative expressions of uncertainty conclusions if the strength of evidence is strong enough. The European Food Safety Authority, they evaluate the evidence, they identify source of uncertainty, and then they take everything into account and express uncertainty in the conclusion quantitatively. So it's one way of summarizing it. But they report if there are any divergent opinions in this conclusion, and if there are sources of uncertainty that has not been taken into account when the experts arrive at this conclusion. So it's one summary which they think are less, it's less confusing for decision makers. So, well, when we then, how do we then choose to characterize uncertainty? It's a choice, right? How precise do we would like to be? So we can go from denial that uncertainty exists to being a very precise and providing a probability for the conclusion. And this is what we have been talking about so far today. Using probability to express certainty in a conclusion. So what we're aiming for is this probability of this statement A given the evidence and the source of uncertainty. So that's the challenges that I'm working with. And I cite here Joseph Cadane. He thinks of probability as a language to express uncertainty and the laws of probability as a grammar of that language. And I think it fits very well into what we have heard so far. When we have that language, we can do all sorts of things. Then it comes to the interpretation. So I refer to this probability as a subjective probability. But when I look under the hood, it's sort of, yeah, as you might have seen, it's not so obvious how to work with this. So we have to remind ourselves that the subjective probability is someone's belief or uncertainty about the outcome K, and it's always conditional on this background knowledge, which I here refer to as K. But we usually drop this condition when we present Bayesian theories, for example. But when I'm working with experts, it's really, really important on how we interpret this probability. We can't be those statisticians doing linear regression. We need to have this interpretation in place to work with them because they are supposed to make the judgments. So we have found out that the betting interpretation is very problematic as it involves values, and it doesn't really fit in a context when we are assessing evidence because we are not the decision makers ourselves. So we use this reference to the standard probability, so the EARN analogy, and we think this is a suitable way of explaining what this measure is about. Some common issues that we have when we're working with experts is that they are so used to think of probability in the frequency interpretation, so they find it very difficult to use it for anything else. And I also find that subjective probability is subjective when we are doing scientific assessment, so it doesn't fit here. And again, I would like to cite Cadane here that any motivation to try to find an objective basis for inference seems to be that science in general, statistics in specific, would lose credibility and face by giving up claim of objectivity. So if I thought that such a claim could be sustained, I would be in favor of making it. However, anyone familiar with science and other empirical disciplines knows that disagreement is an essential part of scientific discourse, in particular about the matters of current scientific interest. So having a language that recognizes the legitimacy of differing points of view seems essential to helping and advance those discussions. So we embrace the subjectivity. We say someone is uncertain, you are to be uncertain. We use this measure, it's called subjective probability because it is subjective. So we're not trying to hide that fact, but we still have this group of experts who feel very reluctant in using subjective probability for those two reasons I mentioned here. So let's bring in some structure to my talk here. So whenever we work with condensing evidence, we have an assessment model, and this model can be written as we want to say something about the probability of A given the knowledge we have. We can break this down into a model which sort of has parameters, and then it's enough to say something about the parameters, and then we just combine it with the model, and then we can say something about A. And of course, we can drop K if we want to. And then whenever we sort of work with doing Bayesian inference on data, that is when we have data and our background knowledge. And then we just want to arrive at this conclusion considering what we know and the data that we bring into the assessment. Okay, so the type of judgments that might occur in this context occurs at different levels in a model or assessment. So we have these judgments about parameters, right? Which then can be referred to as parametric elicitation. Elicitation is that you draw beliefs out of someone's head. We can also say that we ask them to make judgments about new data, future observation, which then would be denoted as predictive elicitation. However, there could be other choices. So let's think that we ask them to say something about the function of the parameters, which could be at the data level, and this is what Dimitri has proposed to call as hybrid elicitation. And we can also just look at, we want to say something about this final conclusion, given what we know, given the data, given all sorts of uncertainty. This is what I call overall uncertainty elicitation. So I work primarily with these two, and then the talks following here will be about predictive elicitation. So how does this relate to each other? Elicitation about parameters versus elicitation about conclusions or overall uncertainty. So what we do is that we work with structured expert judgment. And these are methods that are designed to work when groups are to make judgments. And one can say that we want to have a group of experts, but because they have turned out to provide better solutions on complex problems than if you ask only one person. So there are different methods to do this that has been developed, and these methods have been developed to pool expertise and to minimize any kind of adverse effects that would occur when you work with groups, and you have these biases that might occur when people are going to make judgments. So the methods here are the Sheffield method, which is working with behavioral aggregation. I will explain it soon. The Cook method, Delphi method, and then I call it something the US school because I don't really have a name for it right yet. But it's basically that you treat every individual expert as a separate model, and then you evaluate the impact of that as model uncertainty. But we are not working with that here because all experts are not making judgments or everything. So that doesn't work here in my context. So just Delphi, you might have heard about it, but it is that you learn from others, but you don't interact with them. So this is, it was developed a very long time ago. The experts are not interacting. They sort of, you have to make sure, whenever you work with these methods, you have to make sure that the experts understand what they're going to make judgments about. So they're well-defined questions. A and not A should fill up the whole outcome space, so to say. And that you should all have access to the same dossier, so to say, the same information, that you should be able to comment it and review it and add missing references and so on. So that implies for all of these methods. But the Delphi method is that everyone makes individual judgments without talking, without interaction. And then someone summarizes these individual judgments, and it includes also the reasoning behind the judgments. And then all the experts are able to review this, and they can refine their judgments. Then you can keep on doing this until you reach some kind of convergence, because then you think that they have not influenced each other, but you have been able to see how they think and reason. And if it's necessary at the end, you can do some mathematical aggregation at the end with equal weights of the experts. The Sheffield method is that you actually put them in the same room, you discuss, and you are supposed to reach a consensus. This has been developed by Anthony O'Hagan and Jeremy Oakley at the University of Sheffield. And here the experts are in a group, and you have a facilitator who is skilled, who is trained in working with groups, and you do activities to help them make judgment. It could be that you start with a probabilistic training, and that you sort of listen to people, you make everyone feel that they are welcome and that they can speak up and so on. And you want to, the purpose is to mitigate any group biases. So you can agree on the questions, you review and share evidence, you make individual judgments, and then you share. And you discuss it. Why did you think like that? Why did you reason like that? And so on. So you're trying to clarify. After that, the group are to make a consensus judgment. And this is not like, how do you interpret this judgment? Well, they have this notion of an impartial observer, a rational impartial observer, who is basically someone who would have been in the room, who would listen to all the experts, having seen her opinions and reasoning, and then make his or her own judgment. But it's not a physical person. And then you fit the distribution, a parametric probability distribution, to the judgments provided. So the nature of this consensus distribution is it can have an interpretation as a subjective probability distribution, so it can be used in the probability calculus at the end. Okay. The third method, the Cook method, is developed by engineers, Roger Cook and his colleagues. They don't have interacting groups, and you are supposed to answer seed questions, and based on your performance on these seed questions, you receive a weight when they're going to aggregate it, just mathematically. They take the quantiles and then just weight them together. And you make individual judgments. You don't see other people's reasonings, and there is no specific fit distributions or fitting to the distributions to these quantiles. The interpretation of these probabilities is not clear. You can see where it goes. But I mean, it's a kind of different way of working, and this is a very, very common method that is used many places. So now I'm presenting 3 different methods to you: the Delphi, Sheffield, and the Cook method. And I would argue that the Sheffield method is the one that is closest to resulting in subjective probabilities. There are several tools to work with structured estimates that has been developed. So Sheffield, they have forms and they have suggestions on how to conduct Sheffield workshops. You have several tools for fitting distributions to quantiles, but if you're able, you can just write your own program to do it and choose whatever distribution you want. And for the Cook method, there are tools for calculating these performance rates. Okay, so what role does Bayesian modeling have when quantifying uncertainty in scientific assessment? Well, first of all, what do I mean by Bayesian modeling right here now? Yes, I think it's like when you are specifying probabilistic models for data, which you do in frequentist modeling as well, but just to sort of make clear, you are using Bayes' rule to do inference, and uncertainty in the parameter estimates are expressed quantitatively by subjective probability. That's what I'm referring to right now as Bayesian modeling. And I would say that it's not enough to quantify uncertainty in conclusion, because you need to do a judgment at the end on the overall uncertainty. In this context, you can't just do a Bayesian model and say this is our uncertainty conclusion, because you have to make a judgment. So you recall the sources of uncertainty. There is a lot of sources of uncertainty related to the methodology as such, the model as such. So you have to take a step back and look at, is this a reasonable model? You can't squeeze everything into the Bayesian model. So it's not enough to quantify uncertainty using only a Bayesian model. You need to make judgments as well at the end. But it's very helpful to support this judgment of overall uncertainty, because Bayesian modeling can combine multiple sources of uncertainty and evidence when you make inference. So I'm not saying we should throw it out, but it's really, really useful. But what has happened when this is applied in practice is that there's a lot of focus on making the final judgments. And since Bayesian models are not involved normally in the majority of the evidence going into these risk assessments, a lot of effort is just taking on how we make judgments based on what's there, unfortunately. But we would like there to be more Bayesian modeling involved here. So what one can say is that Bayesian modeling is offering a very flexible framework to do statistical inference for the type taking into account the things we have, like bias adjustment, calibration of assessment models, that we want to combine the probabilistic characterization with other analysis like propagation through model sensitivity analysis or value information analysis. And one key thing is that Bayesian modeling can actually help us to be more explicit about the sources of variability and keep it separate from uncertainty, which is not always the case when you don't have the Bayesian thinking subject probability, because then uncertainty and variability is mixed up into one single probability. So here's an example of a model where you it's a fixed random effects model which is used to synthesize evidence for multiple studies. The development is that one has added this random effect which is describing between study variability or heterogeneity, and this is an example where you can you add variability to a model when you make conclusions, and you can look at what would be the effect in the overall mean effect, or what would be, if we would do another study, what could the effect size be for this new study, which is then the predictive interval. And we see a lot of these examples where we have dose response curves, for example, which does not include components of variability. And then what is uncertainty is becoming disturbed by the way that variability is not or modeled. So if one would, for example, consider variability in this response curve, it would allow for a characterization of uncertainty, in particular to lower doses, which could have a high impact on the regulatory decisions coming from this setting of the lower acceptable dose. So my conclusion here is that we need more people with expertise in Bayesian thinking, in particular subjective probability, to make these judgments of overall uncertainty in scientific assessment. It's not necessary to use Bayesian methods to characterize overall uncertainty, but it's very helpful to synthesize evidence and combine impact sources of uncertainty to keep variability into the models and to quantify uncertainty when we have breaking down the assessment into parts and then combining them like Christian did. So instead of having one question which we're focusing on, we can break it down into several sub-questions and then do modeling on these and then combine them. So that's also Bayesian thinking that could support the assessment of overall uncertainty. And I think that Bayesian methods, they offer a very flexible framework for modeling that is required to take all the caveats into account. And the methods for structured expert judgment that I describe here, it could be useful to actually do elicitation when we work with Bayesian modeling, and but recall that they were primarily developed for making the elicitation of overall uncertainty. So thank you so much.